All right, we're about 5 after, so I think we can kick things off. Welcome everybody to our first ambient work group meeting of 2025. Looks like, oh, this will be interesting. Our first item on the agenda for today. Oh, before I go to the first item, we have one document in the ready for review, or do we have two? Let me scroll up. One in the ready for review and one in still in review. Keith, were you hoping to speak to this today? Keith may not have joined us yet. Looking at that document, I don't see a lot of interaction or comments on it yet. I know it's had some edits pretty recently. So if you're interested in ambient cluster, what the API looked like, Keith's audio is not working, but please take a look at that document. Leave some comments and thoughts, even if your comment or thought is just a thumbs up, or if you think there's a different way things ought to be done. This is the time to sort of collect and gather all of those things, particularly as we've already got the data plane signed off and are working on kind of putting together early implementation there. That being said, our first item on the agenda is Zhonggu, who I don't think is with us this morning. Let me double check. Yeah, I see that. So he's referring to the order of push. I'm pretty sure this refers to WDS. Apparently in ambient, we're pushing workload identities before we're pushing actual off policies against those, which it creates, looks like a race condition where those workloads can be accessed before their policy has been pushed to the Z-tunnel. I am not a Z-tunnel expert nor a WDS expert, so I wonder if someone else might weigh in here. It's a little bit difficult without a link to an issue or pull request. Maybe we do have a link to an issue or pull request. Okay, yes, so we do. I'll add that to the notes. And I'll share it here.
Hey, Mitch, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, Keith.
Okay, I need to leave and come back in. Yeah, I've got a little bit of context on this PR. Keyword, it's a little. It's basically what you said. Right now, we push the authorization resource. Right now, we push the workloads. Then we push authorization resources. The discussion in the PR is proposing switching that, where you push authorization first, and then push workload. There's been a couple weeks of discussion back and forth. From what I understand, the central question is whether or not we should make this change for a third-party non-OSS implementation. So in Istio, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter the order that we press it, that we push things. It's eventually consistent as a system. If there is a workload that references a auth policy that does not yet exist on the Z-tunnel, then I believe Z-tunnel will will drop the connection, not drop the connection, but drop the connection, reset it, and vice versa. There's an auth policy that's not referenced anywhere. It just won't be applied until the workload referencing the policy is it's activated. Actually, it's not an issue on add. It's on remove. If you remove the policy and the workload still, if you remove the policy first and the workload still refers to it, the same thing will happen. So I think, like I said, at issue is whether or not we should accept this change, with the main motivation being, well, I won't go so far as to characterize it as the main motivation, but one of the motivations is a non-OSS implementation.
And it's a non-OSS implementation for Z-tunnel, is that right? Not Waypoint?
Custom control plane, I believe. I'm looking at the...
Okay, so it's the same Z-tunnel, but customer control plane for the Z-tunnel?
I believe, let me find the issue.
Yeah, because I'm confused if it's a customer control plane. Can't they implement in their customer control plane then? Because this.
You're right. You're right. It's
Yeah.
yeah. I think it's you're right. So custom Z tunnel, custom data plane with the OSS control plane.
Right. So our like compensating for lack of timeliness by introducing synthetic delays is a well-trodden path to failure in system reliability.
I don't think any, at least as far as I'm seeing, I'm not seeing synthetic delays recommended as much as reordering of events, right? Instead of A, then B, we'll go B, then A.
Right, but if that in order is synthetic, that's an example of synthetic delay. Right. Like how long do you delay B if A never happens, right? And what's the causality between those things? Eventually you're going to say, well, send B because, well, we're waiting for A, but it never happened. That's synthetic delay.
Yeah. Some of this depends on, or I think Zhonggu's case here effectively depends on understanding the propagation delay, right? Not so much synthetically, but actually observationally. And we've gone pretty far down that rabbit hole in the past, or at least I have.
Right.
And it didn't yield a lot of fruit.
Right. Yes, I remember that effort and it didn't. And I can't think of another policy system like all the Kubernetes network policy implementations, right, have non-ordering, right, eventual consistency like properties, which have denies in them, like admin network policy and the other ones that have just been introduced. And I'm aware of some examples in commercial firewall products. In fact, all commercial firewall products are eventually consistent, as far as I can tell. Mitch, you worked on one of them once upon a time. I can think of some pretty pathological examples in that realm that are far worse than this. So yeah, my knee-jerk reaction, having not read the thread completely, is, but John, you've actually read the thread.
Yeah, well, and Costin, your comment there, just real quickly, in the thread is absolutely right. We can guarantee that we read at startup, state in a certain order, or only start after we have everything. In this case, what I'm saying in the thread is we only start after we have policies and workloads. So this is not a proxy startup time problem. This would be a workload and policy creation time problem. John, did I get that right?
I don't. Sorry, I joined late, by the way. My bad. I don't see it as solving any problems. It's like if you create a workload and an authorization policy at the exact same time, which, by the way, no one ever does because they create, at best case scenario, they create the authorization policy in a deployment, and then the deployment creates a pod sometime later, and then it has to get scheduled and all this stuff. So it's certainly slower. Even then, like the latency we're talking about is like, I pushed it 1 millisecond later. Like, it's totally irrelevant. Like, it doesn't make sense in an eventually consistent system to worry about the details of something being eventually consistently applied, 0.1% faster.
Yeah,
right, and
I think this also
pretend that there are ordering guarantees in an eventually consistent system that has no ordering guarantees.
Exactly.
This also is a great opportunity to mention the value of a default deny policy or posture, because as I understand it, if you have a default deny posture, the failure mode in that 1 millisecond of intervening time is failing closed rather than failing open, which is preferable.
Yeah, and eventually consistent allow is totally fine.
Right.
I don't want to trigger anyone here, but sometimes the 1 millisecond can be intentionally extended to, I know, 5 minutes to an hour a day if you want to add some CI/CD system or some mechanism to save rollout configuration changes for authorization. So I think we need to take into consideration this kind of safe rollout systems. I know Mitch spent a lot of time with this problem.
But
Yeah,
if you're
but the thing
extending the
is, it
delay,
doesn't-
that means you're not applying it, right? Like, how do you, if you're extending the delay in which the config gets propagated, that's effectively the same thing as just not applying the policy. For a
Delay
day.
for some, not delay for, so you deploy to one canary and then you wait until canary has signs of success, and then you roll back, you roll forward, all the complicated things that CI/CD system do.
But it has nothing to do with the XGS push order, right?
I agree. No, it has to do with eventual consistency that we should not assume that eventual consistency is milliseconds. I mean, you apply config and whatever, some magic happens and everyone has a config.
Yeah,
Sure, but we're talking
like
about the
my-
workload and sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, like the semantic model of the WDS XDS is that all the streams are totally independent. Now, if we considered all the streams were completely independent, then it would not make sense at all to have ordering. There's no ordering at all. They're independent, right? We happen to use the aggregated streaming model because it's just easier to reason about. So you have to put an order because you can't send two messages literally concurrently, but it's totally arbitrary what the order is. So anything that is trying to add ordering or like wanting, I don't know, there can't possibly be a benefit unless we're using the protocol wrong.
No, I agree.
I wonder if we could close this gap a slightly different way. What if we had a way to indicate that a given workload required a policy before it was distributed to ztunnel? Basically, like, create a dangling policy ref on this workload if there's no policy applying to it so that it does not get made available by the ztunnel.
So
And we're
the
not
reason
messing with event order, right?
Yeah, the reason we do it the way that we do it in ztunnel is more around it's like there's also the opposite deleting order that we have to consider. It's like, what do you do when a workload references a policy and that policy doesn't exist? Well, there's other two answers. One is the policy is about to exist really, really soon, and then there's no issue with ignoring it. Or the policy was just deleted, but we haven't updated the workload yet, which again, it's no issue with ignoring it because it's about to be deleted. If we, I don't know, I think it gets tricky if we add this like something beyond that.
I guess, John, when you say ignore, do you mean two different things? Because like let me see if I can get this straight. If the policy doesn't exist, but it's about to be created, when we say we ignore, we mean we're not going to route traffic to that workload because we've got a dangling policy reference. If we say the policy doesn't exist because it was just deleted, we're not going to black hole all the traffic to that workload just because we're waiting on the workload to be updated, right?
Yeah, so how it works in ztunnel is a workload has a list of policies, and we go and we look up all those policies, and if any of them don't exist in ztunnel, then it just skips them. It doesn't like fail. It fails open, basically, not fails closed.
Okay.
So like there could, in theory, be an issue if like ztunnel or if Istio said, hey, you should have policy foo, and then it didn't send it policy foo because it had like a split brain scenario. But that would be like a catastrophic control plane bug. That would be odd to do given that the same thing is programming both the workload that's pointing to the policies and the actual policies themselves.
Also, something that's helps my mindset at using that scenario is once the policy is added, all existing connections are then reevaluated on that policy. So it's not like you can stick a connection through while the policy didn't exist and then it's just always open. We reevaluate. So then once if that traffic would have been blocked, now it's going to get blocked again once that policy exists.
Now we could do something like provide an informational log saying policy that was referenced is not yet present, right? But we don't know the semantics of what that means, right? Was it a time, like almost overwhelmingly it would be a timing issue? maybe you could do something like say, okay, it has a policy. We know that policy has existed for a period of time, and so it's no longer informational. It's actually a warning because that's indicative of a distribution problem. But in the short temporal windows that are being talked about here in this presentation, that's not the case. And we don't want to treat workload like a transaction where we say, okay, when we distribute the workload, we embed every single possible policy that would apply to it in it, right? So it's monolithic. Yes, you could do that, but then you have an extremely inefficient system.
It's effectively cap theorem, right?
Right.
We're moving to move towards certainty both on ordering and on consistency across the fleet. You're beginning to look at something similar to a blockchain solution, where you're compromising the performance pretty substantially.
Yeah, Merkle tree this, sign this other stuff, right? All those ways to try and simulate consistency. I mean, for context, without naming names, one of the most popular firewall products on the planet, right? One of the most expensive ones. Their policy update mechanism, at least in some cases, is when new policy is pushed, all policies are unloaded, policies are then recompiled and then reloaded again. And in that window, between unloaded and reapplied, it's fail open for all policies.
Yikes.
By comparison, right? By comparison, we are exceptionally good. That is terrifying, by the way, for those of you running that product in production, if you're worried about timing attacks that are measured in milliseconds.
John, you mentioned that the Z-tunnel fails open when there's a dangling reference from a workload to a policy. Is that true if you have default deny policy across the board as well?
So there's actually two types of policies in Z-tunnel. There's ones that are bound to a specific workload, where then we literally have a list of the policies. And then there's other ones that are tied to global or the namespace, which are orthogonal. And we just say like, okay, this workload's in namespace X. Go look up the global ones, go look up the namespace X ones, and then go look up each of the ones listed. So if you have a default deny, it's probably in the other one, in which case there's no specific reference, but obviously if it doesn't exist, then it doesn't exist.
Right, but admin like default deny policies that are globally selecting would apply because they would resolve and they would default deny.
Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure we don't fail open on default deny. And I think what I'm hearing is we don't do that.
No,
The one exception to that, and I'm going to get trigger Louis here, is default deny peer authentication. So if you have default deny peer authentication, it is a workload translated as a workload policy. So you could get into that scenario with peer authn.
Our peer authn is usually not. Is it workload attached, or is it namespace and system attached? Typically,
for ambient, it was optimization to essentially have the strict policy be static, and we just always send it if we have any peer authns. So actually, I take that back. If since we always send it, if we don't allow any traffic on startup unless we have all resources, then we can't get into the situation except at this very narrow time where it's the very first peer authn that you apply after the workload has completed startup. There is that split second. So this again, very minuscule.
That's eventual consistency, right? Because that human is creating the peer authn policy afterwards. So
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Not triggered.
All right, I'm not hearing anyone advocate for approving this PR or reordering our WDS. Are we in more or less agreement here?
Can I ask a question? This is about the policy on the Z tunnels that is next to the workload that just about started, no?
Yes, it's what it's going to enforce at that unit, in that particular unit of time.
So, I mean, my previous comment on the chat was that readiness and the workload should not receive traffic and kind of be ready or started until, we get a full set of configurations. So,
Well, but that assumes that configurations represent a transaction custom, right? Like, how do you define what full means in that world?
no. What I was trying to get to is, if this is just a startup problem, it is not completely unreasonable to have a small delay on. I mean, because there are other things that need to be to happen before.
To be clear,
Startup
startup is the one use
configured.
case where this is. Sorry, I thought you were done. Please continue.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, to clarify, my understanding is that startup is the one time where this is absolutely not an issue, because you wait for all resources to be delivered to zTunnel before starting up.
You're mixing up zTunnel startup and application startup, I think.
Application startup.
Oh,
that's what I
okay,
mean.
my bad. Sorry, gotcha.
Yeah. So application startup, usually applications, do all kind of things that before. They have probes, they have all kind of other things before they are ready. So there is some interval. There is readiness check. So there is a natural delay. It's not something that happens in 1 millisecond in
Right,
the
but
application itself.
Right, like just ordering here, right? Application startup communication over ambient, right, requires zTunnel startup to be complete to function, right? So zTunnel
is
startup
already. zTunnel is first. There's no question.
As John said, zTunnel has a mechanism today to at least wait a while to get most of the configuration for some definition, which, as we've observed, almost invariably leads to having received all of it. Right, and so probabilistically speaking, right, we're just talking about situations where configuration is changing, right? Authorization policy and workload are being instantly created by the user.
I agree. I see what you're saying. Yeah, it's probably working as intended. It's not a big deal. Yeah, you should not do that if you.
Yeah, like if you could start the application before zTunnel itself had properly started for some definition of what that is, yeah, I could see us being a bit more sensitive to that and trying to do some heuristic things to have a better definition of zTunnel readiness. But this is post readiness.
Post zTunnel readiness, not application readiness. No, but I agree. The case is far too. We need to make sure that we consider readiness and all this stuff, because it's always tricky, especially with zTunnel readiness versus application readiness versus waypoint readiness versus world readiness.
Yeah. John, the zTunnel startup, is it just a temporal based heuristic? Or do we wait for some flag in the
No, so
XWD?
how it works is we connect to Istio. On the first connection to Istio, it's guaranteed to push down all the objects, and we wait until each type has been pushed at least once.
Oh, so we wait for each of the type WDS bundles.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's just...
did you remove? Sorry, go finish up.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's fine. Go ahead, guys.
Did you remove the if larger than 1,000 or whatever switch to on demand?
So we never had a heuristic that was enabled. It was always just explicitly enable. I haven't been. The code is still there, but it's not really used. I haven't heard anyone use it. There's some tests, but I don't know if it's robust enough. There's probably bugs in it.
We still want to consider it a possible feature.
Yeah. Right now, there's no on-demand authorization policy. It's only for the workloads. In theory, you could say don't push these workloads down, more like a dependency model like you have with listeners and routes, for example, and not push them all down. We don't currently do that, but it could be expanded. It's kind of orthogonal from on-demand.
I think it's orthogonal. I think configs are different from. I think the intent was if you have 1 million pods or 1 million workloads and to have on-demand workload, but configs are smaller number than you should not have 1 million configs.
I hope so.
Okay.
Policy per workload, 1 million workloads, no problem. Small Kubernetes cluster.
I think we've probably
I think that
on this topic.
yes. Maybe just TOC consensus is that this is not actually a problem. And that if you want default deny semantics, please use default deny. Admin level default deny.
I will note that. In the meantime, John, I think you've got the next topic.
This Honestly, I may be committing the classic Istio issue of relitigating a discussion. So if we did decide on this, let me know. But I think we didn't. We just think it over the break. It does, like, it's very just subjective, and we talked about it a couple times. So I feel like the DNS proxy, maybe it's time in 1.25 to enable by default. Starting to see more and more usage. Like the most common troubleshooting issue I've seen in the ambient Slack is almost, oh, you didn't enable the DNS proxy. And I haven't really seen the opposite issue of I enabled the DNS proxy and now things broke. I'm talking about the ztunnel DNS key. So I'm just wondering, and like their usage is probably only going to expand in the future, realistically. So I'm wondering if it's maybe the right time to enable it by default. Obviously, you can still opt out. We'll do the whole compatibility profile deal so people don't get change they don't want. Wanted to get some thoughts. See, the hands are going, so.
Do I need to say anything, or you know exactly already what I want to say?
For the rest, why not?
Okay, so actually, it's not what so I'm not against enabling DNS by capture by default. Actually, and probably it will be better to be enabled by default to not have the option to turn it on, turn it off, and all the discussions. My concern is always about compatibility with the standards and interoperability, and the fact that Istio tends to have a disregard for internet standards and behaviors and other DNS servers. If we are 100% sure that the DNS implementation is compliant with the standard, is not a change in behavior, it's compatible with having a real DNS server, then I have no problem. Including basically not losing features like DNS security, which is pretty important and it's growing in adoption and all the other stuff. Otherwise, I have doubts, because if we lose DNS security, it's probably bad.
Ben, you want to go?
Yeah, so it's we did have one bug, and I'll throw it up for context. Yeah, so the only issue I really have a concern with is the IP tables thing, where we hang on, I gotta switch my account. Where we are switching during upgrade, people can be broken basically because we're changing the IP tables rules that are injected if you have DNS enabled, and that can create an upgrade incompatibility. Because we don't reconcile, when you have a pod that was previously ambient enrolled and you upgrade ambient, we don't go into that pod and upgrade the IP tables rules accordingly. Leo added a bunch of stuff to do that, and I have a PR out that can actually, on CNI startup, it will go and look at all the enrolled pods and upgrade the IP tables rules so that we don't have this problem in the future. That's the only thing that I have a concern about for turning it on by default, and I think we should fix that anyway. And if we do, then yeah, I think it should go on by default. We could probably fix the DNS specific issue during upgrade with a specific workaround or whatever. But sorry, okay. And John is saying DNS upgrade only for So if they had, basically if they didn't have it on, they turn it on now, they should be okay. Okay, all right. Then if we're not concerned about that, then that's
it was also a one version change, so
yeah, I still think we need
every version.
Okay, if we aren't worried about people hitting an upgrade bug, then that's fine with me. I vote we turn it on by default for sure. But I still do think we need the reconciliation, because we're going to have another problem like this in the future, I'm sure. But that is orthogonal, so yeah, I'll vote yes.
I got two, maybe three open questions for me. First is the IP tables. I think I have just a little bit of trepidation here, because my understanding is that this is the only UDP capture that we do. So just a bit of nervousness with that, because it's a bit of a kind of a different thing. But it's been working fairly well for a while, so not really concerned about that. I also have a question as far as, if we make it default for ztunnel, why wouldn't we make it default for sidecars, which I think we have not done yet.
Different behavior, very different behavior.
And the
Client
expectation of
overrides, it's a nightmare.
sidecars. Yeah, the expectation for user sidecars is you are to restart them when you upgrade, right? You have to, because they have a sidecar, right? So it's different there.
It's not about the
I'm-
restart, then it's about the behavior, the semantics. The DNS is completely, I mean, if you have client override, you have sidecar, there is a completely different DNS that you get. I don't mind if sidecars get, the DNS from zTunnel, for example, because it will be the same behavior, but the old sidecar DNS, it's a different code path.
Yeah, so that's exactly I'm asking this question. So like, yes, it's a different code path. Yes, sidecars are client side, but presumably the user facing behavior should be relatively the same. Does it make it feels weird to me to say zTunnel DNS is default on and presumably stable, but sidecar DNS is not. If we do want to make that stance, where does it leave us with sidecar DNS? Is it perma beta? We should probably have a conversation about what needs to be done. There, but I prefer to be symmetrical about it, to where they're both at the same status, just for making it easier for you to understand. Lynn and Costin, go ahead and go.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go first. I think your hands are first. Are you sure?
It's okay.
Okay. Yeah, regarding the sidecar comment, Keith, I think that's a very interesting comment. But one angle I would encourage to think about is users don't necessarily need that function for sidecar for service entry. When they use like single cluster, they consume external services. Well, in ambient, though, I've seen in the chat, in our ambient channel, a lot of people trying to explore, even with single cluster, external services. We always have to ask them, hey, you need to enable DNS by default and go back to your ambient install. And by the way, you may have to restart your workload. It just gets the feature really hard for users to use, which we didn't have this problem with sidecar.
Okay, maybe that's what I'm not clear on. What is the difference? I was assuming it was the same feature set would be enabled. I assume service entry needed DNS support for both sidecar and ambient. Why doesn't what makes it more difficult for ambient versus sidecar?
Ambient can only look at IPs, so if you don't have it, then there's
none.
For
gotcha.
Essentially, you just fall back to host name anyway. So it's
many cases. That makes perfect sense. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'm in favor of turning on by default then.
So, Kit, I don't mind turning it on by default for sidecars if it's using the same implementation as zTunnel. So, if we start making sure that whenever we install Istio, we have zTunnel always by default, basically with DNS capture by default. And if you have a sidecar, the sidecar will have the DNS interception provided by zTunnel, even if it's not using zTunnel. Then no problem. That will work perfectly. My concern was with having one behavior for zTunnel DNS and a slightly different behavior for sidecar DNS, both on by default, either the same cluster and on top of that having the standard DNS with global managed DNS or external DNS synchronization and other tools which are perfectly valid and solve the same problem with DNS capture, all three at the same time. So
yes, I mean, Costin, as John mentioned, like they are, nor can they ever actually be the same because of sidecar doing L7 processing to resolve service entry.
No, but DNS can be the same. I mean, you could have the same DNS.
Yes, it could be, and that would also probably imply that sidecars would then have to change their behavior for routing to virtual IP-based routing in addition to or in replacement of the service entry-based routing?
No, DNS is the same. I mean, if you capture DNS, you're supposed to get the same result no matter what you are querying. That's a problem.
No, but remember, the sidecars will look at the host name to resolve the service entry behavior, which zTunnel never will. That's the difference. And we have to decide if that difference is significant or not. it certainly requires work to evaluate whether it's a meaningful difference. Currently, as implemented, it almost certainly is, because the IPs will be different. And that could affect other systems.
That's orthogonal to enabling DNS for sidecars. If you enable DNS, sidecar DNS, an application resolving DNS entry will get an IP address. zTunnel will get an IP address. The point was that we need to make sure it's exactly the same result if you use zTunnel or if you use sidecar DNS. What happened afterwards, that of course sidecars will remain different.
Yeah, no, so I
owns
agree with the
application.
philosophy that it may be desirable, although it may not. We have to establish whether it's desirable that the sidecar-based DNS behavior is actually what we want. It's what we have. And then we can decide if making it the same as zTunnels is also what we want, and whether that would break anybody to do that, right? Which is a different problem.
That's the key. With so many
right.
users out there, who are you going to break? Yeah.
So I think we've established it's okay to turn on for ambient by default. Given the existing user base with sidecar, it's not clear what's safe. And also, it's unclear if it being the same as zTunnel is actually safe for existing users. And now, there's obviously, if you're moving from sidecars to ambient and it's unsafe, the ambient model is unsafe for you, then you'll get broken by the upgrade. So we have to put some thought into it. But I don't think we could couple them, right now.
Yeah, no, coupled. But the bigger discussion here is having a mode where new users, for example, get zTunnel installed by default with DNS capture and everything that is, and sidecars, and they have a way they have consistent behavior, because that will make migration easier. There are probably other things that we may want to switch in the behavior of sidecars if you are in this mode to make it closer to ambient and you don't have breakages.
Installing zTunnel everywhere, so you get zTunnel's DNS behavior. We're going to have to explain the ergonomics of that to sidecar users, because they'll get a DNS set.
And the resource requests.
We already kind of have that problem, but yes. I get what you're saying, though.
For any migration, we'll have to do it. We'll have to do it. It's not possible to migrate from sidecar to move from Istio standard without this.
Yeah, no. Certainly migration users will have both zTunnels and sidecars. So you're right there. And like that, flipping this behavior at some point during that migration is also part of that discussion. I'm just wondering about sidecar users who are not migrating, whether they ever have to absorb that custom.
Yeah, I'd be worried about that cost and that complexity, because if you're a sidecar user not using Istio CNI, now you get 2 daemon sets that pop onto your nodes, and that can get expensive really quickly in large clusters.
Yeah, we get dinged often enough on form factor. We'd have to be super careful with that.
One thing I do want to bring up, because I just realized it's still a thing, is I think what will happen if you turn on DNS by default and then you upgrade your ambient to the version that defaults it to own, any pods you had previously enrolled will not get DNS redirection until you restart them, because we don't have the reconciliation in place. I'm okay if we want to say that's a constraint. But in general, I think it might be good to talk about if we want that to be the standard pattern for how we enable new features like this that might require a redirection change. Do we want people to say, do we want to say you upgrade your Istio with DNS enabled by default now, but you have to recycle all your workload pods that were previously enrolled to get that? Or do we want it to be automatic because we have the reconciliation in place? We just jump into your old pods and upgrade them. Just to point out that's a concern. I don't know how we want that to go, but yeah.
I think we know what users would prefer, right?
I don't know. I don't.
But they think they would prefer, Louis, because there is a difference between what they everyone will say, oh, I want magic, and then, but wait a minute, why it's crashing and creating problems. So some people don't know what they want.
So I think there's multiple scenarios. I think I was reading one scenario. So one scenario is if a user already have a sidecar today, they must restart, right, to use ambient. I think
Right.
that's agreed. The second scenario, Ben, which I didn't get it when I was reading the chat, is if user have the workload running, they're not in Sidecar, they're not using Istio at all. Now they are, you know, having this DNS enabled by default. You're saying we do
No. So if you install 125 and enroll a new workload, it will get DNS capture and ambient capture. If you had 124 installed with DNS off and you enrolled your whole namespace with it, and then you upgrade to 125, none of those pods will have DNS capture until you recycle them.
Oh yeah, that I got it, but that's a given. Even if you use
like it's not a given with
124.
anything we have yet so far.
Yeah,
like if
but
it's a new given is what I'm saying. So maybe we should
No,
talk about
it's
that.
not a new given, because if I use 124 today and I use a service entry function, I still, the moment I enable the DNS in my install, I still have to go back to restart that pod, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's what we
yeah.
have today.
That's what we have today, and with the feature off by default. But if we want to make it on by default and make it stable, is that still the experience we want? Is the question I'm asking. Because
Gotcha.
then we
I think
have
it's
then we
not
have a stable
great.
feature that requires you to restart pods, which, as far as I know, we don't have an ambient so far.
Yes, I agree. I think it's not great, but it's not worse than what we have right now.
No, it is great. It is great. It is very good. It's a good feature to not have this kind of change automatically break your create an outage. It may not look like it's great because it's,
Okay,
user have to do some action, but that's a very good thing. I mean, we have so many outages in Google and everywhere that it's that are caused by this kind of behavior.
Okay, somebody actually like that. All right. Keith, I think you're up next.
Yeah, I'm torn here because to Louis' point, like users will absolutely say yes, do it for me. Like I want Istio to disappear and just make the things work. And one of the big selling points of ambient is no restarts. Even though we might try to make it more nuanced than that, what users are going to hear, what users have heard, and what's excited them is no restarts. So I certainly get the appeal of trying to, of relying on reconciliation to make this a smooth transition. I'm honestly thinking less of the DNS feature specifically and more about how do we handle things that require IP tables changes and on upgrades. I think, in my gut, I think I agree with Costin. We're having this, but having the forced restart is a useful check because if something goes wrong, you know what caused it, or you can point to something, you can point to an event to know. If something starts going wrong, it might not look directly like IP tables rules. You might just start seeing packet drops or DNS latency or whatever else in the future, and it's harder to sort of correlate that with a change. So I like the idea of any changes that require IP tables modification to require a restart. I could be convinced, but that's where I come down initially.
And to be clear, I don't think this should block like the DNS going stable, because I think we can always add reconciliation as an opt-in later if people want it, and then it will do this if you care about it. And if you don't, you just leave it off or something like that. So that's fine.
John, I think you're next.
Yeah, I guess I was basically saying the same as Ben. Like, whether we want reconcile or we don't, we can decide that. Maybe it's an option. I don't know. I don't have the strongest opinion here, but I do think that it's irrelevant to whether we make it on by default. Even if we say everyone agrees we want reconciliation, it's a one-time issue. Like, there's going to be times when you upgrade, you read the upgrade notes, and you have to do a little bit of work. Upgrading all your pods is not so bad. It's not the greatest, but you have to do it once, then okay. You want to use a new feature, you have to accept some churn. In 6 months from now, we will have forgotten that we ever talked about this. It will be totally irrelevant. So I don't want to get too hung up on things like this. Now, if we get in the habit of every single release doing this, which I don't expect, but then we'll want to seriously reconsider. But things like this, kind of one-time minor efforts, I don't know, they tend to be overblown a bit.
So I think what I'm hearing is I'll say I was a little bit caught by surprise that this would by default require a pod restart. I think I understand why CNI is doing the IP table redirects, and that's only done at startup time currently, although we could do it at other times. The concern that I have from an operational perspective is, let's say the user, not a mesh administrator, just an application owner, and suddenly something's gone wrong with my DNS. If my pod just restarted, I'm going to look at what changed about my pod in that restart. And nothing in the declarative Kubernetes interfaces is going to describe to me what has changed. As far as I'm concerned, well, something must have changed because my pod restarted. So I'm going to look for what that change is. Maybe I rolled out a new version of my application, changed some configuration parameters of the application. Maybe it's just an instance on a new node. And that's going to sort of send me in a wrong direction from an investigation perspective. On the other hand, Istio, with its DNS on by default, was upgraded at some time in the distant past, perhaps a week, perhaps a month. We've seen pod life cycles have a long tail of upwards of a year. So you might have to dig as far back as a year if the last time that pod recycled was a year to see, oh, sometime in the last year, I've upgraded to a default DNS posture, and that's actually the root cause of this particular error. Whereas if we go the other way, with sort of automatic propagation, my pod hasn't restarted. Nothing that I can tell has changed about my pod, and yet something about DNS has changed and started causing an issue. At that point, I'm going to begin looking at my service mesh for what just changed recently regarding my network that would have caused this. So just sort of a small nudge or vote. Like you said, John, it is a one-time thing, but I do think it's a little bit more intuitive to have it happen automatically and be reconciled rather than wait an indeterminate time for pod restart.
Right. So like I was kind of going to say the same thing, Mitch, right? Creating distance between the maintenance event and the debuggability is bad. If the property we want is we don't automatically update existing pods, fine. But I would rather the action, the administrator had an action to forcibly re-reconcile without restarting the pod. Right. So I could do Istio couple reconcile IP tables or whatever you want to call it, and it would cause the reconciliation to occur. And you could target it to specific pods. So we decouple it from pod restart, but you still get the administrative control, and therefore you know the event. I think that would be a much better option for users and administrators. Also, there are lots of other reasons, as like the twist lock bug that Ben ran into the other day, right, about running reconciliation loops with IP tables to find out if people have done weird shit, is actually really important in debugging some of the gnarlier production problems that we've seen. So I think that's right. I'm fine with saying, yeah, pod restart, like we don't do it automatically, but we still have to give the admin a way to do it without dealing with all the side effects of pod restart effectively.
Yeah, I don't disagree. One thing I want to make sure we remember and track. Remember this DNS security issues where we rely on DNS to be accurate for the entire security model in Istio because application it gets IP from DNS, and then we apply with eTunnel only knows about IP, so it doesn't know anything about the original intent of the user. So if DNS is compromised, we are compromised. And the problem with service entry and the DNS was that it bypasses the DNS security, normal DNS security, allowing random people who can create a service entry to override DNS, which in turn pretty much nullify all the security postures that we have. It was pretty bad with sidecar DNS because again anyone can put a service entry anywhere and it will impact everyone. I am not entirely sure if it is fully resolved with ambient, and I want to make sure that we are not destroying or by default removing our security by turning DNS on without making sure that we solve that issue. And again, I'm pretty sure it is not solved for sidecar DNS because there is no good way to do it. But I don't remember seeing anything about having it fixed in regular DNS in ambient.
Are you talking about like the permissioning model for service entry creation?
I'm saying a secure naming, meaning that an application wants to talk, Alice wants to talk with Bob. To talk with Bob, it gets DNS of Bob. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's where we apply policies 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how all the security model is for secure naming is based on this 1, 2, 3, 4 from ambient perspective. If someone else can tell us that Bob is actually 5, 6, 6 so another address, we apply the policies for that address. So DNS is a critical element for secure naming, for not for server authenticating a client, authorizing the client, but for a client making sure that it's talking with the server that it intends. I mean, Alice to Bob. That was a bug that we had with that is the main reason we had problems with the old DNS model.
So I guess the question is, right, what's the security model around people's ability to redefine Bob outside of the Istio system, right?
Exactly, especially if Bob is google.com or it's some external address that actually is very important to because we'll verify the DNS of google.com, obviously, because we inject, hey, you want to talk with google.com, the IP address is google.com. We verify the SNI of google.com and the sun. But if someone is saying that google.com is Bob, then the tunnels, okay, you want to talk with Bob, that's IP address of Bob, we verify Bob's certificate. Remember, we discussed it a long time before when we had the problem.
So you're asking basically,
did we solve the problem? I mean, do we have security controls to make sure that only the admin can override DNS of google.com and or Bob, and the sidecar, the service entry is treated as a security element, as kind of, and not kind of something that random people can put in a namespace and then affect other namespaces. That was a real problem, the fundamental problem.
Right, the permissioning model around service entry creation.
Yes.
We do not, John, correct me if I'm wrong, we do not read service entries across namespace boundaries arbitrarily, right? It's either local namespace or admin namespace, right, in ambient?
No, that's not true.
It's flat still.
Yeah.
So it's all.
It's more flat because it's now you know the tunnel is per node and it doesn't know about who's calling. That was.
No, it does know who's calling.
Well, yeah, maybe.
But
I don't think DNS. I mean, I don't know. Unless Johnny fixed it, I don't think it's.
I think the short answer here, right, Costin, is we kicked this problem to admission control. In short, about who can create service entries, which may or may not be utterly satisfactory, right? That's separate from what we do for common name and like mutual, like common name verification, X509 verification. Right.
Except it's not very well documented and it's not really easy to do it. I mean, most people don't remember this. Probably, users have zero chance that they have admission controls for this.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't had it.
I just want to say Lynn's got a hand up for a little while.
Well, so sorry, my hand was not related to costing. I was thinking what Mitch said and what Ben and you all talk about restart. I want to ask a clarification question. My understanding is the restart is only needed if they require to use the new enable DNS function. So if they're not using service entry or if they don't have a reason to use the new function, they don't need to restart, right? They still get all the other ambient function. Is that true? So in that case, user already know they have to do the manual restart. My point is enable this by default is not giving user any actual work other than actually make them a job a lot easier, because today the flow is I, as a user, I actually run into this myself. I had to ping John. I, as a user, I had to figure out how do I enable this? And once I figure out, I have to restart my workload. By enable this by default, it actually make my job a lot easier when I try to explore external service in Istio. I just want to make sure that point clear. It's not like every workload needs restart. It's only impacted by user needing this function, which is true today anyway.
Right. I think the only concern people are having is that if you install the new version and we document in the release notes, it's got DNS capture now, or we do whatever, like, and then, 3 months later, you come back and you're like, wait a minute, I installed that. It's supported 1.2.5. Why is it not working for this namespace? Oh, because I didn't recycle these pods, right? Like, it's a little bit of a gotcha, but I agree it's probably not a big deal for this thing specifically. But yeah, I'm more personally concerned about this kind of thing or this pattern happening again and what we want to do about it. And that's why I think reconciliation makes sense. But yeah, for this specifically, it's probably fine. I'm not going to.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's from a user perspective, it's less work than they actually have to think out to enable this. That's causing their service entry now.
Let's be a little careful here, right? We expect service entry to be quite prevalent, especially in big users, right? So we still want determinism about their seeing the effect of that behavioral change, right? So what Mitch said, right? I don't think, while a lot of things will continue to work, we still want determinism for finding what's broken by this.
But I think we agree that this is not really a blocker. I mean, the fact that restart or not restart. I mean, I think we can live with both ways. So the security is probably
we want to not restart. We can compensate for not restart by having a tool to say turn on reconciliation. We don't have to force reconciliation automatically, but we still need determinism around it.
But I need
even without the tool will survive. I mean, I don't think it's
we need more time to determine if a tool is needed, and the tool shouldn't be a blocker, in my opinion, because we don't know how much this would impact user, because it's only on certain specific scenario, on user not using service entry, and then they using service entry when they.
But Mitch's point is you don't want them to stumble into that, right, accidentally.
Yeah. But I think there's two things. There's two ways to go about that, and maybe both of them are in order. One is determinism, a tool, or not restarting at some determined point. This change happens. The other is potentially cost, and I know you and I in the past have talked about emitting events, particularly emitting a pod event. Well, the first thing you do when a pod's going bad is describe pod, right? So if we emit an event that's going to show up in pod events, that will help to understand, oh, something's changed about our DNS here.
Do we agree that security may be a blocker, but restart is probably not a blocker either way? I mean, it's we can.
Yeah, I don't think it's a hard blocker, but I also don't want to establish a precedent where for upgrade things like this, we throw out one of the primary benefits of ambient. We've done so much work to not restart pods, like so much work, that we then just chuck it. Like that's not good.
We can restart it, but we need to solve before we turn it on by default, or I mean, even if we don't turn it on by default, we need to have an answer for the security issue. And usually, I mean, I think I wrote a document some time ago. The solutions really are to restrict service entries to a specific namespace, to put a RBAC on service entries, and to make it easy to allow some patterns per namespace where you have kind of a suffix, and then you can create arbitrary service entries as long as it's in the same namespace, like food bob.mynamespace.example.com.
Admission control, right? Yeah.
Admission control, but done by us basically, but done by Istio, because we cannot rely on users creating their own admission control for this. I mean, at least with the basic rules, because now we are unsecure by default. If we enable DNS by default, we have service entry by default. By default, you are completely unsecure because anyone can man in the middle. So we cannot ship Istio, with the security model broken, saying that you need to create some separate admission controller to unbreak yourself.
But we do have the same problem in sidecars today, custom for people who have enabled DNS.
If they enable it, absolutely. I mean, it's I had to talk about it, and I probably forget or don't pay attention.
So you're right. At the very least, the documentation needs an update, and it has to warn people that they need admission control at the minimum.
We have this problem for sidecars though.
Yes.
We have we've got auto SAN validation based on host name in sidecars. So in theory, if the DNS hacker if the SAN doesn't match the host name, then that should be a red flag.
No, that's it bypasses that.
Okay, I'll have to take a look later.
Now, if you're saying google.com and the client uses common name verification with X509, right, the man in the middle would fail unless it could validate common name, right? So application level TLS will still function and validate, right? This is independent of that. This is only for in-mesh things. So it's not really about google.com. It's about DNS attacking something else that has a SPIFFE ID. Right, Custom?
Well, if you use your own TLS and you do your own SAN verification, of course you are safe. If you are
Well,
Right,
no,
so
in the
like-
mesh, we
Google-
definitely do.
No, but like for Google, like let's separate mesh versus external. If you want to attack google.com using service entry, you need to attack the trust bundle, right? Otherwise you will fail.
Google.com is special because you usually use library, and library doesn't let you use the HTTP mode. But if you want to get telemetry, and some people do, there is a settings that allow you to disable TLS and use HTTP, plain HTTP with google.com, and then do the upgrade. Remember the change that John did to automatically upgrade HTTP to HTTPS and application getting telemetry and getting all the egress policy and all the other stuff,
Right,
or
but the
redirects and other things. But yeah, it's mostly in mesh. I mean, let's focus on in mesh.
Okay, yeah,
mesh
I think
probably the
I
biggest
think
problem.
it is just in mesh. Like I'm not. Let's take the redirection attack
Yes.
offline. But
Yeah.
So for in mesh, right? So you wanna attack Bob, where Bob is an in mesh service. You have to be able to create the FQDN of Bob, which means you have to be able to write a service entry in a name. Let's assume that you can't write it into the same namespace that Bob exists in, right? So you have to be able to write into another namespace, but pretend to be in Bob's namespace.
So that's really the rest is what service the admission controller or Istio needs to make sure is that if it's Bob, if you have two service entries for the same name, which one does take priority? Who's the owner of the name?
Okay, so I think we
if
could
yeah.
certainly say that only like an admin namespace could create names in the spaces.
With arbitrary FQDNs, yes, that's part one. But you still want to have to give namespace owners to ability to control some names for that namespace. So you need to be able, because it's too limiting to say only your system can define service entries.
Right, but they can be admin namespaces, right? Okay, so what is an example where I need to create a name in my namespace for something that's not in my namespace, that is in the mesh?
No,
Like, I understand.
bob.namespace.foo.com. So basically, if you want to change the suffix, you have the suffix, arbitrary suffix for your domain because you want to use your own, but you still have namespace in it. I mean, the second component is a namespace.
All right, I mean, that's definitely a new feature to do that, I think.
Or some policy. I mean, you have some admission control has a policy that specifies this namespace is allowed to create names like that with a pattern or something.
Mm-hmm.
So question, can this be solved by providing documentation to user while they have proper admission policy or access policy?
If you show me, if you can point to a admission policy that does this, yes. If you are saying that, bring your own, we have no idea how to do it, we cannot tell you how to do it, but you probably need to figure it out. And by default, when we install, it will be broken until you bring your policy. Probably it's a bit more.
So I want to be careful about not creating unnecessary burden relative to other similar security problems in Kubernetes, right? I'm pretty sure you could do.
Yeah, because cluster local, cluster set local. That's why they have the limitations on suffix and the strict naming.
I'm pretty sure OPA Gateway could do this. So
if we say when you install Istio, you're required to also install OPA Gateway and this policy.
No. Right. So we can't force security on people, right? People who don't want it, we can't force them to write deny by default. Same thing, right? We can tell them what the best practice is so they can achieve it.
But are we going to tell them that by default, when you install Istio, secure naming is broken and any namespace can override it?
We can tell them that the override exists.
So insecure by default until you install OPA. Without DNS enabled, it's no problem. You are good. You are secure by default. when you
Oh,
bring
are you?
DNS with these semantics, yes, because DNS is controlled. You cannot create an entry for Bob unless you control the DNS server, and that's already protected.
How is right? So this is the thing, right? How is DNS controlled? Right? You go to another enterprise and you're saying some other system, which we presume is secure, which may not actually be true, right? And saying that's the equivalent requirement on Istio when we don't actually can't assert that.
Well, DNS is, since DNS controls your TLS certificates for the domain and probably far more than that, it's usually tightly controlled in all enterprises. It's not something that people play games with.
Except for creating services in Kubernetes, right? Which is ad hoc. And they're just carved out.
It's carved out because they have a strict naming rule. So you have service.namespace.svc cluster local. So that's,
yeah, ours is more flexible. I agree with that.
And that's where the problem comes in.
I think you could compare this to editing the host names file.
Yeah.
Like within Kubernetes, you can create with Istio arbitrary names that capture traffic, and you should lock that down just like any reasonable sysadmin will lock down editing the host names file. It can still be edited, and there are still valid reasons to do it, but it should be locked down to certain administrative privileges.
And certainly
And
not random namespaces.
Yeah, and you can change the host name, like set DNS configuration for your pod, but you can't change the DNS configuration for pods in different namespaces.
Okay, Cousin, I think what we probably need at this point is a more concrete proposal for the limited admission control that you think might make sense as a reasonable default.
Yeah, I think I shared the document, or maybe I didn't. But yeah, I'm not against it. Again, it's just that we need to put some controls that users have by default. I don't really care about the details. Just to have something in place to say when you install Istio, there are some with DNS enabled by default. There are some limitations by default. Either something, not you must enable OPA.
You can't create a name and then this in a namespace unless it matches this glob rule.
Exactly. A mesh configs that say per namespace the names must follow those patterns, and you can put whatever, put your FQDN suffix, whatever. But not arbitrary namespaces can define arbitrary names that override DNS.
Can we put that as a best recommendation for using service entry? Don't we need the similar recommendation for sidecar also? I'm just thinking loud here.
Yes.
I mean, if people enable DNS for sidecar, yes. If we had what Kit proposed, which is to enable DNS by default for sidecar, yes. But since DNS is not enabled by default, and again, at least some vendors don't allow or recommend using DNS.
Right, but even without enabling DNS in sidecars, Cousin, they have that problem because of hostname.
Right. Yeah, because your service entry is global, you have to be mindful on your host.
Yeah, no, it is a problem. I'm not saying it's not a problem. It's just that it's more acute with this, and it's real.
And by the way, we've had this issue with sidecar for a long time too, and I think user might complain in the past, but they get it. They are supposed to use unique hostname in their external service.
It's not unique. It's the fact that any namespace can override, can impact your namespace. So you believe some evil, test namespace entries and impact your other namespace.
Yeah,
and I don't think users understand this. I don't think many users understand this.
But service entry in sidecar is global, right? By default, if I, as a user, create a service entry, I'm impacting everybody else in the mesh, even though I don't own your namespace. So this, it's what we shipped with sidecar for the past 7 years.
True, but that doesn't mean it's right or people understand the implication of this. And if they don't complain, it doesn't mean that again, people don't complain about things they don't know.
So how about this? If we enable this by default, we provide docs, make it clear, hey, when you have this enabled, these are the caveats you have to watch out to, better avoid duplicate host name within your mesh as part of your service entry.
It's not about avoid duplicate. It's if you enable this by default, it means that any namespace, you basically you no longer have half of the security. You no longer have secure naming. Clients cannot trust servers. That's the implication. It's not about best practice is not to hack yourself or not to let other namespaces hack you.
Was that true?
For names except SVC cluster local, which are protected by, even that I'm not entirely sure about.
No, I'm just thinking, Custom, about like in the nature of the attack, right? Ultimately, the traffic's going to go to an endpoint. So if the service being attacked is Bob, and the endpoint it ends up in is not in Bob's namespace, I believe we do check that the namespace that the service belongs to must match the endpoint's namespace Biffy ID. Right, so the name was attacked, and the traffic ended up where it shouldn't, but the mutual authentication will fail.
No, it will not, because Istio will tell you, hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 6 is the address you are talking. Probably the SPIFFE, corresponding SPIFFE is actually the ABIS SPIFFE service account, and handshake will succeed. Because we
Let's
verify,
take this
we
part
know that
offline, but
destination.
I'm not actually sure that that's the case.
How would we know that the IP should verify Bob's service account if the IP is already the IP of, we operate based on IPs, not on names.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying, but John and I did discuss this quite a bit a while back. Yeah, we need to take this offline. We're also 15 minutes over time, so.
Yeah, let's take this offline because we have another meeting too. Michi, are you going to say something to wrap up?
Oh, I was going to say the same thing.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. Thanks everybody for joining. Bye.